Hi, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of Malice in the Mitten. I am your host, Tracy Preston, along with my bestie, Christine Mulligan. Hey, Christine.
Hey, Trace. Hey, everybody. What are we getting into today?
Girl, let me tell you something. I had a very hard time with this story, and I'm not kidding. This has really affected me, and I know that for Angela, who did the research and writing for the show today, she was also deeply affected as well. Reading and watching videos about these crimes made my heart just pound so hard in my chest. I felt uneasy, sickened, appalled, heartbroken, disgusted, and absolutely horrified about the details of what this monster was capable of. The details of what one man did will leave you feeling the same way. This story is not for the faint of heart, and this I promise. So, with that being said, please know that if you decide to listen, it's going to be rough. So, let's get into it. This is Season 4, Episode 13, John Norman Collins, a.k.a. the Co-Ed Killer, the Ypsilanti Ripper, and the Ypsilanti Killer. And this reign of terror happened from 1967 through 1969. All right, here we go. John Norman Collins was born in Windsor, Canada on June 17, 1947, to Richard and Loretta Chapman. John was the youngest of 3 children. John's father was in the Canadian Services under Her Majesty, where he was an infantry officer and was an explosive and demolition expert. When Richard was in World War II in 1944, he had lost his leg, and therefore he was no longer able to serve. John's mother divorced Richard, claiming extreme mental cruelty and that he was an abusive alcoholic. However, friends and family said that they never saw any abuse toward Loretta or the children. Richard had given Loretta full custody of the 3 children in their divorce, and as in many divorces, which I hate, sometimes a parent may speak untruths to their children to pit them against the other parent, and that's just what Loretta did. So much so that the children didn't want anything to do with their father. Now a single mother, Loretta was struggling to support her children as she worked multiple jobs after leaving Richard. It wasn't long after Loretta's divorce from Richard that she remarried. However, that marriage, that only lasted about a year before she was divorced a second time. Looking for a new start, Loretta packed up her children and headed for Michigan, leaving Canada in 1951, and relocated to Center Line, which is just north of Detroit. This is where Loretta met and married her 3rd husband, William Collins. And he legally and formally adopted all 3 of Loretta's children. But this marriage would not be the proverbial 3rd time's a charm. Oh, no. William, he was an absolute violent man with a drinking problem, and those 2 ingredients do not fare well together. William would brutally beat Loretta and the children on the regular. There was one fight that occurred between William and Loretta where William picked up John and threw him across the car into his mother. When John was just 4 years old, so he's just a little guy, right? When John was just 4 years old, William was confronted by a man with a gun. And for what I have no idea, but instead of handling his own bullshit like a man, like a coward, he picked up this little 4-year-old boy, John, and used him as a shield so he wouldn't get shot. Can you imagine that?
I don't think I'm going to be good with this story because you barely made it into the headlines and I'm already judging this guy upside down, left and right, and every way in between. I just can't with the abuse of the children. I just can't. It just makes me, I hate him already, thoroughly. So is he going to be the murderer? I mean, I'm jumping already to the end now, and I'm like waiting for this guy to fry. This is the part of the story I'm waiting for already.
Oh, get ready. Yeah, so this is the stepfather. So I'm just kind of laying the groundwork of the bullshit, the horrible life that John, was
Okay.
raised in. Yeah. This is just William, the stepdad, the bullshit he was up to. But yeah. Now, at the age of 5, John was still wetting the bed at night and wearing a diaper to school. And that's just one side effect of what childhood trauma can do to a kid, right? And we've talked about that in previous shows on our round robin. But Loretta and William, they liked to party. And when they wanted to go to the bar for a night of heavy drinking, instead of just, leaving the little kids at home, they would load the kids up in the car and leave them there until they had enough drinking for the night. Like, what in the actual? I'm thinking it would have been better if you just left them at home. I mean, did they think that this was the more responsible thing to do as a parent?
Well, what time frame are we thinking about? Because I have a feeling that was like commonplace back in like the 1940s, is you would just let your kids play in the car while you were in the bar.
Yeah,
I feel like the thing back in the 40s.
Yeah, this is in the right now, this is 1956.
Okay,
so
track a little bit.
I don't know. The whole thing just kind of blows my mind. It's like, really? Why don't you just leave your little kids at home locked up in the house in their warm little beds instead of leaving them in a car?
Yeah, but that wasn't good either, because how many kids, burnt the house down and died while their parents were out having a party? I mean, childcare wasn't the best. I mean, even when we were kids, and that's going back to the 70s and 80s, we were like the latchkey kids. We were always left alone.
Yeah.
So the generations before us, Lord knows what they would. I mean, literally, some of them used to sleep in dresser drawers. So, we do have to keep that in mind. Childcare was not the thing.
Yeah, well, what do they do if they have to go to the bathroom? I mean, they could be in the bar for 4 or 5 hours. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think they cared. I don't think they cared.
Truly. Truly, they didn't. All right, so as a teenager, John attended St. Clement High, which was a Catholic school, and he was popular. Handsome, polite, an honor student, captain of the football team, president of the Sikh club, a star pitcher on the baseball team, and he was also on the wrestling team. John also had a Triumph in high school. It was a motorcycle, and boy, oh boy, did he love that bike. And when he needed parts to fix it, he would just steal them. Boom, problem solved.
Classy.
Right. After high school, John enrolled and attended Central Michigan University. But after a year, he changed schools and enrolled at Eastern Michigan University, where he majored in education, as he wanted to teach upper level elementary school kids, like 4th and 5th grade. Now at Eastern, John was the vice president of the ski club. He continued to play sports and even joined a fraternity. But when things were coming up missing, it was John that they suspected, and he was booted out of that fraternity. Now, at this time, young women were also coming up missing, and their bodies were found dumped in fields horribly defiled. It was clear that these women were not murdered where they were found. So, girls are coming up missing already at school. It's now halfway through John's sophomore year at Eastern, and his grades started to significantly slip. He was slated to graduate in 1969, but he was short credits, and he didn't really seem to care about making those up so he could, walk with the rest of his class. And at one point during the year, John was accused of cheating on one of his exams by his professor, and this is when John amped up his life of petty thievery, along with other horrific crimes. This is also when his sexual appetite was ramping up, but he was a total hypocrite. When a girl was dancing seductively for him, he rattled off the 6th commandment at her, quote, "You shall not commit adultery. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." All right, dude, really?
Okay, so he was a wackadoodle. He was a wackadoodle from the start, apparently.
Mm-hmm. Well, right. So, I mean, we already laid the groundwork of what a horrible life he had, and God only knows what else this kid went through. So, I mean, it sounds like, he pulled his shit together, doing amazing at school. And this guy was a good looking dude. Big, strong, handsome, beautiful smile. Boy, was he hiding a monster, hiding a demon. One of John's former girlfriends said that the two of them are walking across campus together when he started, kind of touching her and feeling her up a little bit. And then as quickly as he started, he stopped. He grabbed her, pushed her back from him as he asked if she was having her period. When she said she was, he looked at her with vile disgust in his eyes and said that was disgusting, and angrily walked away from her, leaving her dumbfounded. On another occasion, John gave a girl from college a ride on his motorcycle. When he came to a wooded area, he pulled over to relax for a moment and take in the sights. He asked her, "What would you think if I was the co-ed killer and that you could be the next potential victim? How would you feel about that?" She thought he was joking, but she could tell by the look on his face that this was not a hypothetical question. John told another girl he was friends with that he didn't like girls with pierced ears as he felt they were defiling their bodies. He told yet another girl that he had once strangled a cat with a clothesline as he put his hands around her throat. Then one day, John had found his sister Gail, who was pregnant at the time and in bed with someone other than her boyfriend. Wow, John flew into a rage. He beat that man to a bloody pulp until he was unconscious, and then turned his rage toward his sister, screaming at her that she was a tramp as he pounded her with his fist. What we have here in John is true psychopathy. He has no empathy, no remorse. He is bold, no inhibition, and is egocentric. He has superficial charm and does not have the ability to feel stress and projects an outward appearance of normalcy.
Well, you're also forgetting that he's also religious because he's quoting Bible verses and apparently holding up very high, I don't want to say morals, very stringent
Ideologies.
ideologies. There you go.
Look at me with the big word.
Yeah, so, you gotta take that into account too. He's already the whole Bible thumping, screaming quotes at people. You know what I mean? Like that in and of itself. That should be like a whole nother.
Yeah, and I almost wonder if, he slipped into, the religion bit because maybe he was already struggling. Or maybe that's how he coped with the crazy shit that's going on at home. Because he put on a good front. You know what I mean? He was doing all the right things, great grades, participating in sports, rocking the sports. But underneath, boy, was there something boiling, bubbling, waiting to come out.
Yeah, overcompensation at its best. But also that fixation and ideology and Bible verse, Bible thumping, that goes along with paranoid schizophrenia. So, did we find out that this guy's a schizophrenic? I wouldn't be surprised.
I wouldn't be surprised if he was either, but I didn't really see any clear details about that, but I wouldn't doubt it.
Yeah, sounds like it to me. But go ahead. What else?
All right, so John had even written an English paper about if a man wants to kill, well, he can kill, and without guilt. And that is to him the perfect crime. Quote, "If a person wants something, he alone is the deciding factor of whether or not to take it regardless of what society thinks might be right or wrong. If a person holds a gun on somebody, it's up to him to decide whether to take the other's life or not. The point is that it's not society's judgment that's important, but the individual's own choice of will and intellect." How about being that English teacher? Or professor, I should say.
In other words, he's saying that smart people would kill people.
Right.
And he's touting himself as being a smart person.
Exactly. And, he's the what am I trying to say here? Like the ruler of his own
domain.
Yeah, I make the rules. All right, so as I mentioned, abduction and gruesome murders were already happening in the areas of Ypsilanti, which is where Eastern Michigan University is located, as well as its neighboring city, Ann Arbor, which is the home of the University of Michigan. The first victim was Mary Felzar. She was born in Ypsilanti in Willis, Washtenaw County on December 4th, 1947, and that day was cold, snowing, and it was an icy day. She grew up in a home built by her father on the family farm, and she lived there with her mom and dad, 3 sisters, and 3 brothers until she left for college. In fact, when I say family farm, that's exactly what I mean. Not only did they have their home where they all lived, but their grandparents had a home there on this property. It must have been pretty big. And also, she had aunts and uncles that were also living on the property in their own home. So this was a very close-knit family. She attended Immaculate Conception Catholic school for elementary and middle school, and then transferred to Lincoln High School and graduated in 1965. Mary was 19 years old in 1967. She was a student at Eastern Michigan University majoring in accounting. She worked as a secretary while attending college. Her favorite brand was the Beatles, and I was totally into them as well, so she's got good taste. She enjoyed sewing, knitting, drawing, and painting. She was a pianist, a bass drummer, a timpanist, which are kettle drums, and also played the organ at church. She absolutely loved shoes, music, and singing. And her favorite quote was, "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams," by Eleanor Roosevelt. Mary was last seen by a neighbor walking towards her Ypsilanti apartment on the evening of July 9th, 1967. A relatively close neighbor just happened to look out the window and saw not only once, but twice, a young man in a blue-gray Chevrolet slow down as it approached Mary before stopping next to her. The second time the car approached her, it pulled into a driveway in front of Mary, making her walk around the car. The witness also saw Mary react to the man, shaking her head no and continuing to walk. So perhaps the man in the Chevrolet asked her if she needed a ride. Something about the interaction must not have felt right, as the neighbor continued to keep an eye on Mary and the man in the car. But soon, Mary disappeared as she continued on her way to her apartment. Too bad he didn't follow his gut and just walk outside and check on her. I mean, hindsight, right? Mary's nude body was found by 2 15-year-old boys on the Scottness abandoned farm near Getty's and the Forge Road in Superior Township on August 7, 1967. She was identified through her dental records.
I betcha he felt bad.
Yeah. Like, how do you deal with that? You know, I mean, he could have saved her just by getting out there. The corpse was badly decomposed. The pathologist who examined Mary's remains was able to determine that she had been stabbed approximately 30 to 40 times in the chest and abdomen with a knife or other sharp object. Her feet had been severed just above the ankles. The pathologist determined that they were smashed with something, as there was no cut marks on the bones. Her thumb and sections of her fingers on one hand were missing, and her forearm had been severed from her body, and that forearm has never been found. Despite the advanced state of decomposition, the pathologist was able to locate multiple linear abrasions on the victim's chest and torso, indicating that Mary had been extensively beaten before her death. Although police believe Mary had been raped, due to the advanced state of decomposition, conclusive evidence was lost. After a thorough search of the crime scene, it became apparent that Mary's body had been moved 3 times throughout the month before being discovered. Initially, the body was on top of a pile of bottles and cans hidden by very large trees. From there, she was dragged 5 feet into a field where she remained exposed in the elements for 2 months. Shortly before her body was discovered, the murderer again returned, dragging her body another 3 feet. Police also found articles of Mary's clothing during the search. Under piles of soggy cardboard was her orange polka-dotted dress. The zipper still zipped, but her dress was torn down the middle. They also found a bra that had its straps torn from it, and a pair of ripped white panties, and something that resembled like a pad, like a sanitary napkin, as if she had been on her period. 2 days after Mary had been identified, a young man claiming to be a friend of the Felser family showed up at the funeral home for Mary. This young man asked if he could take a picture of Mary while in the coffin as a keepsake for her parents. He was denied his request. The young man asked why, and he was told because, quote, that's a fucking disgusting, creepy request, and the body is decomposed. The young man said, quote, you mean you can't fix her enough so I could just get one picture of her? Pretty unreal. When investigators asked about a description of the young man, he was described to be in his early 20s, close to 6 feet tall, medium build with a light complexion, and he was a handsome young white man with dark hair, and that he had driven a blue-gray Chevrolet, and that he didn't have a camera in his possession. Police had no other leads, nothing to move forward on for now. The Felser family denied knowing who this person was, so with nothing to go on, the police concluded that perhaps the killer was a transient, someone popping in, committing a murder, and then left. It's now July 5th, 1968, almost 1 year since Mary's murder. A partially decomposed, mutilated body of a 20-year-old art student at Eastern named Joan Elspeth Schell. She was found by construction workers on an Ann Arbor roadside. She had been raped and stabbed a minimum of 47 times with a knife, approximately 4 inches in length. Her lungs were punctured as well as her liver and carotid artery. She also had a stab wound behind her left ear, breaking through her skull and penetrated into her brain. The force of that stab into her head fractured her cervical spine. Her throat had been cut, and her miniskirt was tied tightly around her neck. She had also been sexually assaulted. Joan had been dead for several days before being discovered. Her lower body was remarkably preserved, but her head, shoulders, and breasts were in an advanced state of decomposition. It was concluded that her body had been stored in a naturally cool environment, but the upper portion of her body was exposed to sunlight. So she was outside, so it seemed like the bottom part of her body was, maybe in the shade or, had some grass on it, stuff like that. It was determined by the medical examiner that Joan lost 4 pints of blood from this attack, but the lack of blood beneath or near the corpse, plus the testimony of eyewitnesses, led investigators to determine Joan's body had been in this location for less than 24 hours. Her murderer had likely driven to this dumping site to dispose of her body. It was thought that the killer tried to conceal the body somewhat with clumps of grass. Detectives felt that Joan and Mary's murder were connected, and with that, 4 detectives were assigned to work full-time on solving both cases. Joan was born on December 1st, 1947, in New Paris, Wisconsin, and she had recently moved into a house on Emmett Street in Ypsilanti. Oh, and guess what? John Collins lived across the street from her. Yeah, how about that?
Well, now he's shitting too close to where he lives.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is obviously where he gets busted, but go ahead.
Not yet, believe it or not. Joan was last seen by her roommate, Susan Colby, at the Washtenaw Avenue bus stop on the evening of June 30th. Joan had intended to travel to Ann Arbor to visit her boyfriend, so Susan went with Joan to the bus stop to kind of hang out with her. Susan later informed investigators that Joan told her that she was going to hitchhike because she missed the last bus. Susan told investigators that one of the first vehicles to pass when Joan stuck out her thumb was a red and black Pontiac Bonneville, and it contained 3 young white men inside. The vehicle slowed to a stop. Then the driver had asked her, "Hey, you want a ride?" Susan described the driver to be around 20 years old, clean-cut, short, dark, side-parted hair. Susan also said that she tried to get Joan to not go with the men, but Joan took the ride and promised to call her when she made it to her boyfriend's home in Ann Arbor. Susan should have heard from Joan in, approximately 30 minutes. Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor aren't that far apart from one another. But 3 hours had gone by and still nothing. Susan called the police and reported Joan missing. Atta girl. I just can't believe that they even took the report, right? Because what did they say? Oh, she's an adult. I mean, she's only gone for 3 hours. But I'm guessing because of the previous murders that they were like, we're on it, right?
You would hope, you would assume, but yeah, that's probably what they were thinking.
Yeah. The search was on for the owners of the red and black vehicles in the state of Michigan. Investigators researched and eliminated over 150 registered owners, and they came up with nothing. But one thing the detectives now had was a composite drawing of the driver from Susan. So at least they have an idea of what this man looked like. On August 18th, 1968, all possible leads had been exhausted, and the number of detectives assigned to the case would be cut in half. But just because the team had been reduced didn't mean that this was no longer an open investigation, because it was. There was a reward posted for almost $8,000 for information leading to the conviction of the perpetrator of both homicides of Mary and Joan. As the detectives continued to work the case, they came upon a couple of eyewitnesses who said they saw Joan walking with a young man on Emmett Street the night she disappeared. Although neither eyewitness was certain, both believed this student to be John Norman Collins, a student at Eastern Michigan University majoring in elementary education who lived directly across the street from Joan at 619 Emmett, and whose physical features sure did look like that composite drawing from Susan, Joan's roommate. One of the witnesses interviewed was a supervisor from the university's Alumni Relations Office, where Collins worked, said John would torment a co-worker with graphic details of Joan's body. So off the detectives go to talk to John, and when they asked him if he knew anything about what had happened to Joan, well, he flat out denied even knowing who she was, and insisted he had spent the weekend of June 29th through the 30th with his mother at her house in Centerline and had not returned to Ypsilanti until the morning of July 1. Initially, police took him at his word. And they didn't even verify his alibi. Like, oh my God, are you freaking serious? You wouldn't follow that up? Talk to the dude's mom? They just believed him because he was that handsome, that all-American looking college kid? You have 2 brutally beaten, stabbed, raped, and pulverized, murdered young women of whom you're investigating their murders. Like, do the work, boys. Please. Like, what in the actual hell?
But you gotta remember, that was how things were back then, at that time. If a well-dressed, dapper-looking man said something, they were like, okay, good on you, sir. Have a great day. I mean, they took people at their word. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, thanks for your time, sir. Bye. Unreal. It makes my blood freaking boil. Lackluster detective work. I mean, look at the girls you've got. Come on. Anyway.
Yeah, a firm handshake, and they were good to go, I'm sure.
Yep, and a tip of the hat. Have a great day.
God.
Mm-hmm. Now, on March 20th, 1969, a 23-year-old University of Michigan law student named Jane Louise Mixer disappeared after posting a note on a college bulletin board because she needed a ride across state to her hometown in Muskegon. This was an important trip because Jane was going to have a pretty big conversation with her parents. You see, she had just gotten engaged and was going to be leaving Michigan and moving to the Big Apple of New York City. Jane was born February 23rd, 1946. She graduated high school as a valedictorian, and over the objection of school officials, had given a fiery graduation speech calling for social justice. My kind of girl. Joan began classes at the University of Michigan, and she was more determined than ever to bring change to the world. Jane was one of just 37 female law students in a class of 420. Phil Weitzman, Joan's fiance, said, quote, whatever she got involved in, she was extremely passionate about. He also said that he wanted the two of them to announce their engagement together to her parents, but Jane said she wanted to go home alone to talk with her parents and felt that she could convince them that this was a good thing. This is when Jane planned to go home first, with Phil following a few days later, and this is why she posted a note on that college ride board, looking to get a ride to Muskegon. Phil said that no one thought anything of it, posting your address and phone number with what you're looking for, because everyone did it in those days. He said that Jane found a ride home with a man named David Johnson. Phil's sister Barbara talked with Jane all the time on the phone, and during this time, she had told Jane that Phil should be with her to talk to her parents. But Joan was firm and told her that it would work out better this way. Barbara didn't like it, not one little bit, and she made sure Joan knew that. The last words Barbara ever heard Jane say was, "Trust me." With her ride all set, Joan told her parents to expect her to arrive by 9:30 p.m. that night. But 9:30 came and went, still no Jane. By 11 p.m., her father just couldn't sit there and wait, so he set out to look for her. He drove for hours and hours, but he couldn't find his daughter anywhere. Sometime that night, Jane was brutally murdered. Her fully clothed body, covered with her own raincoat, and with a copy of the novel Catch-22 placed by her side. She was found the following morning atop a grave in Denton Cemetery in Van Buren Township. Her autopsy revealed that Jane had been shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber pistol, then garroted with a nylon stocking which the pathologist noted had not belonged to her. She didn't have any stockings on. The pathologist also stated that Jane had not been sexually assaulted, that death had occurred at approximately 3 a.m. on March 21st, 1969, and like the others, Jane had not been killed where her body was found. Even though the pathologist concluded that Jane had not been sexually assaulted, her tights had been pulled down below her thighs, and also seen was a sanitary napkin, which suggested there was a sexual motive behind the murder, and although the victim had not been beaten, stabbed, or mutilated, she was a student at U of M. She also had a garment tightly around her neck, and the proximity of her abduction and murder, it was just too coincidental for the investigators to think that all three of these murder victims are linked. It was just 4 days after the discovery of Jane's body that another body was found. It's March 25th, 1969, when a surveyor discovers a nude, mutilated body of a teenage girl lying on top of a blue jacket behind a vacant house on a remote, rural section of Earhart Road, just a few hundred yards from where the body of Joan Shell had been discovered 8 months earlier. And oh boy, he is amping it up. Just 4 days later, he's struck again? I guess he wants that feeling more and more. The power he must feel, and he can't get enough.
Well, he struck again so quickly because something must have happened with the law student because he didn't sexually assault her. So he must have been interrupted somehow. So he didn't get his rocks off, so he had to get another one quicker.
Yeah, and guess what else? She was having her period. And he thinks a woman having a period is absolutely disgusting.
Yeah, but there was another body that had sanitary napkins found near her too. So I'm not quite clear if he goes after them when he knows they have their period, or if that's a deterrent. I don't think that's a deterrent for him. I think that enrages him.
It does enrage him. And so the first girl that was murdered, Mary Felser, they couldn't tell. I mean, they assumed she was probably sexually assaulted, but her body was so degraded that there was no way they could even get any evidence. So they can just say that they feel that it was sexually motivated, but whether he had sex with her or not, I don't know.
Yeah, this guy. Ugh. Okay.
Investigators at the crime scene could tell that the savagery seen on this victim was much worse than the others. One investigator described the injuries as being the worst he had seen in 30 years of police work. An autopsy revealed the victim had died of numerous fractures covering 1/3 of her skull and one side of her face. all of which had been inflicted with a heavy, blunt object. These injuries had been inflicted after the victim had been brutally beaten and tortured. Her killer had placed a section of her own white shirt into her trachea to muffle her screams as she was pounded with blunt force trauma to the face, head, and body, including several deep lacerations believed to have been inflicted with a leather strap. Welt marks upon the chest and shoulders indicated the killer had also used restraints to hold the victim face down as he whipped her torso and upper legs with a leather belt before tearing, oh God, this is brutal, before tearing a branch from a nearby tree and forcing it 8 inches into her vagina. Blood spatterings and churned soil close to the crime scene indicated she had been beaten close to where her body was discovered, and that she may have attempted to escape her attacker. The victim was identified as a 16-year-old Romulus High School student named Marilyn Skelton, who had disappeared while hitchhiking in Ann Arbor. Marilyn was born on March 4th, 1953. Now, it is known that her father, Archie, was quite abusive and an alcoholic, along with her mother. So Marilyn's home life was not a good one. She was a troubled teen and had already had some run-ins with the law. One particular officer took somewhat of a liking to her and tried to help her out many times, but to no avail. Police did question her father, Archie, and thought of him as a suspect for some time, but both he and her mother passed polygraph tests. Regardless of Marilyn's decisions in life up to that point, she was a human being, and she did not deserve to be murdered. Marilyn, like many, was hitchhiking to see her boyfriend. Now, we all know that hitchhiking is a dangerous business, but in the 60s and 70s, everyone was thumbing it. Literally, everyone who needed a ride was hitchhiking if they didn't have a vehicle. Marilyn was last seen alive outside a drive-in restaurant on Washtenaw Avenue 2 days before her body was discovered. Investigators again saw strong similarities between this murder and the previous killings attributed to the Michigan murderer, including the fact that a garter belt had been tied around Marilyn's neck and her clothes and shoes had been neatly placed beside her body. However, the dramatic increase in savagery exhibited against the victim and the fact that Marilyn was a known drug user, dealer, and occasional police informant, as opposed to a university student, that led junior investigators to speculate her murder may have been drug-related. Ann Arbor Police Chief Walter Krasny formally linked Marilyn's murder to the series. Following the March 24th murder of Marilyn Skelton, police from the 5 separate jurisdictions where the murderer had abducted and disposed of the bodies of his victims formally combined resources to compare notes and see if they could identify the perpetrator. Although investigators had informally exchanged information with the agencies from other jurisdictions, they kind of did it on a regular basis since the previous summer. No coordination to combine efforts and resources had ensued until the discovery of the 3rd victim linked to the series of murders. By early April, each of these law enforcement agencies collectively assigned 20 investigators to work exclusively on the 4 homicides. Little physical evidence existed beyond eyewitness description and forensic reports, but what they did have was this. All of the victims were brunette, Caucasian. All of the women, with the exception of Jane Mixer, had unspeakable violence inflicted upon them with blunt and or bladed instruments prior to their murder. Each of the victims' bodies had been found within a 15-mile radius of Washtenaw County, and each victim, again excluding Jane, had received knife wounds to the neck. Each victim had been found with an item of clothing tied around their neck, and each woman had been menstruating at the time of her death. These factors led police to publicly conclude the same perpetrator was responsible for at least 3 of the murders. But wait, there's more. At 6:30 a.m. on April 16th, 1969, the body of a 13-year-old schoolgirl named Dawn Louise Bassam was found beside a desolate road in Ypsilanti. Dawn Bassam was born November 28, 1955. She was just a baby. She was a student at West Junior High School in Ypsilanti. Clothed only in a white blouse and bra, which had been pushed up to her neck, Dawn had been repeatedly stabbed in her chest and genitals. She had multiple slash wounds across her breasts, buttocks, and stomach, then strangled to death with a 2-foot length electrical flex cord, which was still around her neck. A handkerchief was stuffed deep into her mouth. Dawn's body had been left where she would easily and quickly be discovered. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Dawn was last seen alive at 7:30 p.m. the previous evening, walking home from a friend's house just barely a mile from her own home. She had been accompanied part of the way by a friend named Earl Kidd, and he told police he and Dawn parted ways at a desolate road just 5 blocks from her home. It was here that Dawn began the rest of her journey home, walking along railroad tracks. An eyewitness reported seeing Dawn walking at approximately 7:35 p.m., and that's the last anyone saw of her. Just 100 yards from where Dawn's body had been found was a deserted farmhouse. When police searched it, they found an orange mohair sweater, which is what Dawn had been wearing the night she disappeared. In the basement were glass shards like those found in the soles of Dawn's shoes, electrical flex cord, and fresh bloodstains, all pointing to this being the scene of Dawn's murder. 1 week after Dawn's murder, a detective conducting a routine examination of the farmhouse basement discovered a scrap of cloth from Dawn's blouse. He had also found an earring that belonged to Marilyn Skelton. It appears each item had been staged, indicating that the murderer had returned to the scene of the crime and that the 2 homicides were linked. Approximately 1 month after the murder of Dawn, the farmhouse where it is assumed she had been murdered was destroyed by arson on May 13, 1969. Once the fire was out, investigators noticed 5 lilac blossoms arranged evenly in a row across the driveway that led to the farmhouse were noticed. It is theorized that each lilac blossom symbolized each victim. At this point, with 5 brutal slayings of young women, the public was really putting on the pressure to the police to find and catch this goddamn killer. Sandra Felzar, the victim's sister, she's the sister of Mary, the first girl that was murdered. She wrote an open letter to the Ypsilanti Press in April 1969, asking the public to come forth with information, quote, not only for myself, but for all young girls who are forced to live in this constant fear for our very lives. Sandra wrote this letter on the day of Dawn's funeral. Newspapers across Michigan published her letter, and this is what it said. Quote, have you ever walked from class to class on campus without looking over your shoulder for fear of someone was watching you? I haven't. Have you ever had a stranger smile at you and you want to smile back, but have been afraid to? I have. Have you ever driven down Getty's Road without shedding a tear? I haven't. I am a sister of one of the victims of the brutal, perverted murders that have taken place in this community within the last 2 years. My sister was the first. Whose sister will be the last? Many of you will read this letter and pass it off by consoling yourselves with, it could never happen to me. But I believe that after 5 of these slayings, it should be obvious that murderers have no respect for persons and that any one of you could be next. I think it is time for the people of the community to exercise their rights as citizens and do their part to see that justice is brought about. I am therefore making a personal appeal, not only for myself, but for all the girls who are forced to live in this constant fear for our very lives. The appeal being that you, the public, come forth with any information you may have, which in some way may be relevant to these murders. And guess what? Sandra's appeal worked. Over 800 tips came in. However, they did not lead investigators any closer to solving the crimes. But wait, there's more. Less than 2 months after the murder of Dawn Bassam on June 9th, 1969, 3 teenage boys discovered a partially nude body of a young woman in a field close to an abandoned farmhouse on North Territorial Road. The victim had multiple slash and stab wounds to the body, including 2 stab wounds which had pierced her heart, a gunshot wound to the forehead before her neck had been cut through to the spine. The victim's right thumb had also received a gunshot wound, suggesting the woman had instinctively raised her hand to protect herself before her killer fired at point-blank range. She had also been raped, although the pathologist was unable to determine whether this act had occurred before or after death. Sections of her clothing were scattered around her body, and one of her shoes was missing. The victim was identified the following day as 21-year-old University of Michigan graduate student named Alice Elizabeth Colomb. She disappeared shortly after midnight the morning of June 8th, 1969. Alice was born December 25th, 1947, and she had lived in Portage. Her father, Joseph, was a proud father who loved his daughter very much. When he found out that his baby girl had been brutally murdered, he reacted as only a distraught father would. He shouted at the reporters trying to get the story in real time. He said, quote, "I didn't come here for her body. I'm not going to claim her body. I'm going to tell parents not to send their children to this university. It's too big. They don't give a damn about anything but money and politics. I'm not going to bury her. Let them bury her on the president's lawn." He glared at one newspaper reporter and said, "I've worked too damn hard to raise her to send her here. I don't want her dead." So here's what's known. On Saturday, June 7th, 1969, Alice was a University of Michigan Fine Arts graduate student. She went to the Depot House at 416 South Ashley Street in Ann Arbor to celebrate the birthday of a friend who was a local musician. When Alice left her apartment, she was nicely dressed in a purple blouse, a white miniskirt, pantyhose, and a pair of brown loafers. She was wearing her contact lenses and not her glasses this night. She was carrying her new pair of purple dress shoes because she didn't want them to get wet. Alice was also wearing a distinctive, multicolored, horizontal striped raincoat. Alice was last seen at the Depot House dancing into the wee hours of Sunday. That's what some people at the party told police. Others said they thought she hadn't gone to the party at all. Alice's partially nude body was found in Ann Arbor Township off of US 23 and North Territorial Road in 2 feet of tall grass just off the lane running through the abandoned farmland. This is where the teenage boys came across her lifeless body on Monday the 9th at 3:40 p.m. A young man by the name of Benjamin Kaloji was taking a photography class with Alice. He said, quote, "I went to Alice's apartment Saturday night. We were both taking a photography class at U of M, and she left prints floating in the rinse water and images were getting damaged. So I hung prints up and waited for her. By 11 a.m. on Sunday, I called the Ann Arbor police to report Alice missing when she didn't come home all night. The following day, Monday, June 9th, the police found her murder site, the Washtenaw Sand and Gravel Company. They also found Alice's distinctive raincoat, some buttons torn from her clothing, her loafers, and a pool of blood. When I learned that Alice's body had been found, I drove to the police station, and they held me overnight, telling me that I was their prime suspect in her murder. They took me to the morgue to identify her body before they even called her parents. They pulled out the slab. She had been outside for a couple of days. Her eyes were wide open, her skin discolored, and a bullet wound was visible on her forehead. I identified Alice, and all the cops said to the morgue tech was, "Go tag her," and walked away. About a week later, my teaching friend Marissa invited me over to her farmhouse off Nixon Road and Pontiac Trail. By this time, my name had made it around to the newspapers. I walked into my friend's house, and her boyfriend attacked me. Thinks I came to rape her or murder her or something? It was terrible. I lost lots of friends over the Alice Colomb media mess, not to forget that I lost Alice. 2 years later, I'm teaching at Pioneer High School, and the cops bring blood-stained clothes and pictures of Alice for me to look at. The rudeness of the police asking overly personal questions about our sexual relationship. They wouldn't let me rest and forget. He went on to say, 4 police departments didn't seem to be sharing information. I had to repeat things hundreds of times. Police weren't helpful or compassionate. They just cared about who was going to get credit for solving the crime. There were many abandoned farms in the Ann Arbor area. For our class, Alice and I used to take pictures of timber frame barn shells. The barn siding mostly salvaged from them. We went to one abandoned farmhouse on Pontiac Trail. There was a cord hanging from the ceiling that looked like a noose. Alice put her neck through the noose-like cord and made me take a macabre photo of her standing inside this creepy farmhouse. I believe the cops still had that photo somewhere. The police confiscated all of the film and pictures from Alice's apartment. Alice was last seen walking home to her apartment on Thompson Street. The discovery of several dried bloodstains and 2 buttons missing from the victim's raincoat at the Northfield Township commercial gravel pit on June 10th indicated that she had been murdered there. Investigators publicly claimed prior to Alice's murder they were satisfied that the 3rd victim initially linked to the Michigan murderer, Jane Mixer, had been killed by a separate perpetrator. The fact Alice had also received a gunshot wound to the head led investigators to reconsider the possibility Jane may have been murdered by the same perpetrator. By the spring of 1969, public outcry regarding the murders committed by the individual dubbed by the press as the Michigan murderer and the co-ed killer was increasing, particularly among the student population of Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. The increase in frequency in which the killer was striking throughout the spring and summer of 1969, coupled with the fact most victims had been connected to the University of Michigan or Eastern Michigan University, suggests the killer may be a fellow student. Many female students began to carry weapons such as knives. Others started doing the buddy system, whereby they would refuse to walk anywhere unless in the company of a trusted male friend or at least 3 other girls. Sales of tear gas, knives, and security locks increased. Hitchhiking became a rarity among students, and the reward offered for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the murderer increased from $8,000 to $42,000. And in today's money, that would be $351,400. It's now July 1969. Not a single woman in these 2 cities felt safe. There's a maniacal killer running amok, and now there are 5 women in southeast Michigan that are dead, and a 6th one is missing. More than 1,000 convicted sex offenders have been investigated and eliminated as suspects. Over 800 tips from informants have been actively investigated, and several thousand individuals had been interviewed. Although Washtenaw County Sheriff Douglas Harvey conceded at a press conference that same month that investigators had little physical evidence to act upon and that the perpetrator had yet to make a serious misstep, he was adamant that the murderer, still at large, was due to pure luck and not for lack of police effort. At the request of an Ann Arbor citizens community, a Dutch psychic named Peter Herkos traveled to Washtenaw County on July 21st, 1969, to generate a psychic profile of the murderer. Herkos accurately predicted that the murderer was a strongly built white male under 25 years of age who had been born outside of the United States and who rode a motorcycle. Having led investigators to the previous location where each of the victims' bodies had been discovered, Herkos revealed details of the murders to the investigators, which had not been released to the press. Although this information proved to be of little help throughout the actual manhunt, Herkos also predicted that the individual would shortly strike one final time. Now, side note here, the killer actually paid Herkos a couple of visits, unbeknownst to him, and he thought this dude was a quack. Well, he seems to be pretty spot on if you ask me. Herkos was correct. There would be one more murder. 18-year-old Karen Sue Beinman was also a student at Eastern Michigan University. She was last seen alive on July 23rd, 1969. She was reported missing by her roommate, Sherry Green, when she failed to return to her dormitory after curfew. Upon questioning both of Karen's roommates, police learned that Sue had last been seen shortly after noon on her way to a wig shop downtown. 3 days after Karen was reported missing, her new body was discovered face down in a wooded gully alongside the Huron River Parkway. Her autopsy revealed that she had been extensively beaten about the face and body, with some lacerations inflicted being so severe that sections of her skin had been removed, exposing subcutaneous tissue. She had received extensive skull and brain injuries, which had been inflicted with a blunt instrument. She had been forced to ingest a caustic substance, and her neck, shoulders, nipples, and breast had been burned with the same caustic agent. Just like the other victims, a piece of cloth was stuffed into her mouth and down her throat. Karen's cause of death was listed as strangulation, even though the blunt force trauma to her skull and brain were so extensive that those could have caused her death as well. Whatever object was used to beat Karen's skull with was never located. The forensic examination of Karen's body revealed that she had also been raped prior to her murder, and that her torn panties had been forcefully shoved up inside of her vagina. Now, here's the slip up those panties contained: the presence of semen and 509 human hair clippings measuring less than 3/8 of an inch. These hair clippings were predominantly blonde, and as such did not belong to the victim, whose own hair color had been dark brown. Weird, right? Mindful of the fact the killer had previously returned to sites of his previous murders to move the bodies, possibly in a sexual ritual, so there's that necrophilia, police theorized he may also attempt to return to this one as well. Although earlier attempts to enforce news blockouts as the discovery of Dawn and Alice had proven unsuccessful, this time the cops pulled it off. No one was alerted to the latest killing. Karen's body was replaced with a mannequin, and the gully surrounding the mannequin was monitored by undercover officers. Got a little sting set up here. At approximately 12:15 in the morning, the following morning, one of the undercover officers saw a young man running from the gully, but due to a heavy rainstorm, along with a ton of pesky bugs, it kept the officer from seeing the man actually approaching the gully. Although this officer attempted to radio the sighting to his other undercover officers, the rain rendered his radio inoperable. Like, what? Can you believe this? They were so close to catching this guy.
Oh, so they botched their undercover sting.
Mm-hmm.
That's ridiculous. So now the murderer at this time now made it to the mannequin, sees that it's a mannequin, and then obviously runs away because he thinks that somebody is stinging him. So he thinks that he's being entrapped. So now he knows going forward, like, if there's another one. So you already said to me that this was the last murder, but thankfully, hopefully, you're going to tell me that they're going to catch him another way, because they ruined a perfectly plausible booby trap.
Yeah, they jacked it up big time. Like,
That's
what?
fun.
Unreal. Unfreaking real. So what I'm going to do here is, yes, there's a whole lot more coming. I mean, a whole lot more. We're going to dig deeper into the investigation. So this is where we're going to end today's episode, and we will pick up next week and begin with the investigation. Sorry, guys, but this is a heavy story. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back and having a listen. We really appreciate you. We will see you back on Wednesday for Round Robin, and then we'll see you back the following Monday on Malice to conclude the story of John Norman Collins, and we're going to dig deep into the investigation. So have a great week, everyone. Bye.
Bye.